In 1988, Japan was shaken by one of the most brutal crimes ever committed. A 17-year-old high school girl, Junko Furuta, was kidnapped and held captive for 44 days. What happened during that time was so horrific that she is often remembered as the girl who lived 44 days of hell. Today we'll revisit the tragic case of Junko Furuta, her promising life, the unimaginable suffering she endured, how the crime unfolded, and why her case remains one of the most disturbing examples of cruelty in true crime history. Junko Furuta was born in 1971 in Misato, Japan, a quiet suburb of Tokyo. She was known by friends and family for her bright, infectious smile and a cheerful disposition that could light up any room. Described as exceptionally hardworking and dedicated, Junko meticulously balanced her demanding high school studies with a part-time job. She was the kind of person who took her responsibilities seriously, always striving for excellence. Her life was one of quiet discipline and hopeful ambition. In an era of immense economic prosperity in Japan, she dreamed of building a stable, successful future after graduation. While she was a model student who avoided common teenage rebellions like smoking or drinking, she also harbored a secret passion. Friends recall her love for music, and a quiet aspiration to one day become a singer, an idol on the vibrant Japanese pop scene. But in the shadows of this prosperous society, a different kind of youth culture was festering. Her quiet, disciplined lifestyle made her an anomaly, and tragically, it also made her a target for a group of teenage boys with dangerous connections to the Japanese underworld. The group was led by 18-year-old Hiroshi Miyano. Miyano and his associates were not just typical troublemakers, they were deeply enmeshed in a world of violence and intimidation. As low-ranking members of a Bosozoku motorcycle gang, they had ties to the Yakuza, Japan's notorious organized crime syndicate. Their days were filled with petty crime, extortion, and brutal assaults, activities that gave them a sense of power and control that they lacked in mainstream society. They operated with a chilling sense of impunity, believing their connections made them untouchable. These two worlds, one of light, hope, and diligence, the other of darkness, violence, and nihilism, were on a collision course. Junko, completely unaware of the danger that lurked so close, was simply living her life, focused on her exams and her future. In November 1988, her path would tragically intersect with Miyano and his gang. This chance encounter wasn't just a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, it was the moment a predator, who had been stalking his prey, decided to strike. On November 25, 1988, Junko was riding her bike home after a long day at school. One of the boys, Hiroshi Miyano, intentionally knocked her off her bicycle. Pretending to be a good Samaritan, he offered to walk her home. But instead, he led her into an ambush. Junko was kidnapped and taken to a house in the Ayase district of Adachi, Tokyo. This house belonged to one of the boy's parents, but they never intervened. From that night forward, Junko would never return home. The shoji screen slid shut, not just on a room, but on a life. Behind it, an ordinary suburban home in Tokyo's Adachi ward was about to become the setting for a 44-day descent into a living hell. What followed was a nightmare beyond imagination, orchestrated by 4 teenage boys. The leader, 18-year-old Hiroshi Miyano, 17-year-old Joe Ogura, 16-year-old Nobuharu Minato, and 17-year-old Yasushi Watanabe. All were low-ranking members of the Yakuza, steeped in a culture of violence and impunity. For them, Junko Furuta was not a person. She was an object, a plaything for their most depraved impulses. The first week was a brutal introduction to her new reality. The beatings were relentless, administered with fists, golf clubs, and bamboo sticks. She was systematically starved, deprived of sleep, and forced to endure unimaginable humiliation, including drinking her own urine and eating cockroaches. The psychological torment was just as severe. They forced her to call her parents and pretend she had run away and was safe, her captors listening to every word, a chilling reminder of their total control. Junko's pleas to be let go were met with threats against her family, a cruel tactic that paralyzed her with fear and sealed her fate within those 4 walls. As the days bled into the 2nd and 3rd weeks, the cruelty escalated into methodical, sadistic torture. The boys, growing bolder, began inviting friends and fellow gang members to the house. It's estimated that over 100 people saw Junko during her captivity. They came and went as if visiting a macabre attraction, some participating in the abuse, others watching in silence. Her body was used as a canvas for their barbarity. They inserted foreign objects, including fireworks, into her body and lit them. They dropped heavy weights onto her stomach, causing severe internal bleeding. They suspended her from the ceiling and used her as a human punching bag. At one point, they doused her legs in lighter fluid and set her on fire, inflicting third-degree burns that would never heal. By the fourth week, Junko's body was a landscape of agony. Her face was swollen beyond recognition, her eardrums were ruptured from the constant beatings, and she could no longer walk. The burns on her legs had become severely infected, and she was suffering from extreme malnutrition. Yet, the abuse continued. Her pleas for mercy, for a doctor, for death, were met with laughter and more violence. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire ordeal was that it unfolded not in a secluded dungeon, but in the family home of Nobuharu Minato. His parents were in the house. They knew a girl was being held captive. They heard her screams. They saw her horrific injuries. But fearing their son and his dangerous friends, they chose to do nothing. They pretended not to see, not to hear. For Junko, this must have been the ultimate betrayal, the final extinguishment of any hope that an adult, a figure of authority, would intervene and save her. Despite the unimaginable pain, she fought to survive. She begged the boys to kill her and end her suffering. In a moment of desperate courage, she tried to call the police but was caught. The punishment for this act of defiance was even more severe. She was forced to lie on the floor as they dropped a heavy iron barbell onto her abdomen, again and again. Her spirit, which had endured so much, was systematically crushed. She was trapped, with no allies, no escape, and no hope. The world outside the shoji screen continued on, oblivious, while inside, a young woman's life was being brutally and methodically destroyed by a group of teenagers, in a house where the adults who could have saved her simply looked away. By January 1989, Junko's condition had worsened dramatically. She was malnourished, her body broken, and her spirit crushed. On January 4th, after losing a game of mahjong, the boys took their anger out on her one last time. They beat her with iron weights, set her legs on fire, and left her unable to move. After hours of torture, Junko succumbed to her injuries. She was just 17 years old. The boys placed her body into a 55-gallon drum, filled it with concrete, and dumped it in Koto, Tokyo. Just a few weeks later, police received a tip connected to another crime. When investigators followed the lead, they discovered the drum containing Junko's remains. The discovery shocked Japan. The details of her captivity and the brutality she endured quickly spread across the country, horrifying the public. The 4 boys responsible were arrested. But because they were minors, Japanese law protected their identities during the trial. However, their names eventually leaked to the press and they became infamous worldwide. In court, the level of cruelty was revealed in full detail. The prosecution described Junko's final 44 days, presenting evidence that sent shockwaves of disbelief and anger through the nation. Each revelation was more horrific than the last. The defense, however, built their case around a crucial legal technicality. The perpetrators were minors. They argued that while their actions were heinous, there was no premeditated intent to kill, a key distinction under Japan's Juvenile Act. This strategy aimed to shield them from the harshest penalties, framing the tragedy as youthful delinquency spiraling fatally out of control, rather than cold-blooded murder. Yet the sentences that followed were shockingly lenient. Hiroshi Miyano, considered the ringleader, received 20 years in prison. The others, Joe Ogura, Shinji Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe, received sentences ranging from just 5 to 10 years. None were sentenced to life. The judge cited their age and the supposed possibility of rehabilitation as mitigating factors. The leniency of the punishment sparked outrage in Japan and abroad. After serving their time, most of them were released, free to return to society. For many, the sentences were not just lenient, they were an insult to Junko's memory, and a catastrophic failure of the justice system. Junko's parents, who had endured the gruesome details of their daughter's final days, were left utterly devastated, feeling that justice had not been served. Many argued that the justice system had failed Junko, whose suffering deserved far harsher penalties for her killers. The case became a lightning rod for intense criticism of Japan's Juvenile Act, with the public questioning a law that prioritized the rehabilitation of violent young offenders over justice for their victims. The profound disconnect between the severity of the crime and the leniency of the punishment forced a national reckoning, raising difficult questions about accountability, reform, and how a society protects its most vulnerable. The case of Junko Furuta remains one of the most infamous crimes in Japan. It has been studied, retold, and remembered for decades, not only because of the unimaginable cruelty, but also because of the failure of society to protect her. Her story became a rallying point for discussions about juvenile justice, victim protection, and the treatment of women in Japan. Even today, more than 30 years later, Junko's name is remembered as a symbol of innocence lost and justice denied. The story of Junko Furuta is one of the darkest tragedies in modern crime history. A young girl full of hope and dreams was robbed of her future by senseless cruelty. Her case forces us to confront difficult questions. How can justice truly be served in cases of such brutality? And how can societies prevent such tragedies from ever happening again? Junko's name lives on, not just as a victim, but as a reminder of the importance of protecting the vulnerable and seeking justice, even when the system fails.